It's a pleasure to welcome Bob White to be with us. Bob is one of the founding directors of the Faraday Institute. Back in 2006, he and Dennis Alexander established the Faraday Institute. He was, until recently, Professor of Geophysics in Cambridge University. He retired from that last year. And he's written lots of things about disasters, about climate, and I'm sure he'll introduce you to some of the books that he and others have written together on that. And today he's going to be talking to us on disasters, COVID, and a Christian response. And I think the way we could do that is Bob will talk first of all, and then we'll take general questions and answers afterwards. So Bob, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. And I turn things over to you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. I haven't checked. We haven't had a chance to check the audio yet. Is this working all right for people? Yep, good. Okay, well, thank you very much. I've been asked to speak about climate change and pandemics, and I'm glad to do that because horrible as this current pandemic is, it's actually a walk in the park compared with the effects of climate change that are coming. What do I mean by that? I mean that climate change is already killing hundreds of thousands of people per year. But because by and large it happens the other side of the world and not on us, not to us much, just a bit inconvenient for us perhaps, we don't really notice it much, whereas the pandemic we certainly do notice, don't we? So I'm going to spend the first half of the talk talking about climate change, which I've been asked to talk about, and then the second half talking about pandemics and a Christian response to them. And actually, there's very similar commonalities between response to both climate change and to pandemics. And I guess once we're through this pandemic, we'll get back to thinking more seriously about climate change again. I'm going to share my screen, so let me see if I can get that going. Now I want to pull this up to full screen. Good. Hopefully you can all see that. So I've already outlined what I'm going to do. The way I'm going to do it is in each case, talk a little bit about scientific issues and then talk about some theological issues, particularly biblical Christian responses to these issues. So this slide I made yesterday, or just before the announcement today, which you might have heard on the news, that 2020 equaled the hottest year there's ever been, which was 2016 globally. So actually this is already out of date, but the last 5 years have certainly been the hottest ever on record, more than that in fact. So we've already had an average increase across the globe of 1.25 degrees centigrade, which might not sound much, but I'll show you that it is a lot. Apart from anything else, that's only about half of the temperature increase which we're now committed to. If we stopped emitting carbon immediately tonight, the global temperature would still increase to about 2.5 degrees globally. And that's because there's such a slow uptake of heat into the massive thermal reservoir of the oceans primarily. You might also have heard on the news this morning that actually this is the average. If you look at, say, the Arctic region, temperatures there have gone up 6 degrees above pre-industrial levels this last year. And that's serious because ice reflects sunlight quite nicely. It's nice and white. But if you melt it and make water, that absorbs heat even more. And that's why temperature is going up much faster in the Arctic areas. And that's a serious result. So furthermore, you might, it's hard to imagine it, isn't it, at the moment with the cold weather we've got at the moment, but you might remember it being really hot last summer and the summer before and the summer before. The 8 warmest summers on record are the last 8 years, in fact, globally. And this last September was the hottest on record in England. And a point I want to make is actually it's not just the global increase of temperature that matters. It's the rate of change of temperature, which is a primary problem for us. Because in the past, if you were mobile and temperature got a bit too hot to be comfortable to live, I mean, in the distant past, you'd just move a bit further north or south if you're in the southern hemisphere. But you can't do that nowadays because we are bounded by national borders, as we know even more strongly with all the Brexit and everything else that's going on. And you can't cross boundaries because people fight war over national boundaries. Um, and so the issue is not the actual increase per se, it's the rate at which it's changing, and we can't adapt to that, people can't adapt to it. And the natural world cannot adapt to it very easily either. So it's a rate of change which is driven, as you know full well, by burning fossil fuels. We're burning fossil fuels which took about 1 million years to accumulate in the space of 1 year. And we're pumping this greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And it will take 100 years or more for it to be reabsorbed back into the earth. And so we're committing the earth for many generations to a big temperature change. Now, the link between climate or global temperature and carbon dioxide has been well understood for 150 years. It's not something new. And I'm showing this graph at the bottom because this shows the average temperature change over the last 160,000 years, which is roughly one glacial cycle. Glacial cycles last about 110,000 years. We sort of understand why that is. It's changes in the orbital parameters of the Earth around the Sun. They're called Milankovitch cycles, slight changes in tilt and so on. And the reason for showing this is that the difference between an ice age and the present time, which is a temperate interglacial, is only a matter of 7 or 8 degrees. And so 2.5 degrees is a big percentage of that, obviously. The other thing I want to point out, shown by that red oval, is that for the last 10,000 years, the climate has been incredibly stable. And there's a good reason to think that it's that stability of the climate which has enabled human culture and societies to flourish, particularly sedentary societies where you can plant your crops this year and you can be pretty sure that the weather will be more or less the same next year. And so they'll grow, and so you can eat things next year that you've planted this year. Now, if you go out of that regime, it's much more difficult. So maybe this stability that we've seen for the last 10,000 years is a crucial part of why humans have flourished. Now, I want to put on top of this the change of carbon dioxide over the past same period, just to show that they're just very tightly linked. You know, carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up, and vice versa. Now, what I haven't put on this is what's happened in the last 100 years or so. Let me do that now. That's what carbon dioxide has done. As of today, actually this is already out of date, which I made a little while ago. It's 415 parts per million carbon dioxide today, pretty well double what it was for for all of history and for the last several 100,000 years indeed. If we carry on as we are, carbon dioxide will reach about 800 parts per million. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see from that correlation that if you're going to pump carbon dioxide up, then the temperature is going to go up. It's not a sophisticated argument, actually, because they're so tightly linked. You might argue about the details of how much it will go up, which depend on all sorts of other factors, but there's no doubt it's going up. And as I say, that's been well understood for 150 years. There's nothing new about that. Now, we can look even further back in time. We can look nearly 500,000 years back by looking at ice cores. This is a picture of an ice core repository. There's a big one in Cambridge, British Antarctic Survey. And they're interesting because you can measure the age of the ice just by counting layers, because it snows more in some times of the year and it freezes in others. So just like tree rings, you can count your way back through many thousands of years. And there are bubbles trapped in the ice, and I've circled one in red there. And they're little repositories, snapshots of what the atmosphere was like at the time. So you can measure the carbon dioxide content, you can measure you can infer the temperature from oxygen isotope levels, because different oxygen isotopes fractionate differently at different temperatures. And so we can get quite a good record of temperature and carbon dioxide going back even further than that last glaciate I showed you. In fact, it goes back 450,000 years from this ice core. So what I'm going to do now is show you the same sort of graph, which has got temperature along the bottom. Methane I've added because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas even than carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide at the top. And what I want you to notice as we sweep through the last 500,000 years is they're all linked. As one goes up, the others go up. They all go up and down together. So hopefully you can see that in all these curves here. And you can also see those glacial cycles of about 100, 110,000 years each. And as I say, we're in an interglacial at the moment. Again, I haven't put on what's happened in the last 100 years or so since the Industrial Revolution. I did that before with carbon dioxide. There it is at today's value of 415 parts per million. Methane, even more. That's up to 1877 parts per billion. And in fact, since I first drew these graphs a little while ago, I've gone off the top of the scale of all of them because we're just going up so fast. And that is the problem. We've taken the Earth out of a regime it's been in for millions of years. We've never known, the Earth has never been subject to such high levels of greenhouse gases as exists now. And that's one of the reasons why it's more tricky to predict what's going to happen in the future. But for sure, it's going to get hotter. That's very obvious just from that correlation. Now, the Earth hasn't always been this hot. In fact, it's likely, it looks from the geological record as if there's been periods where it's been covered in ice right across the globe. And in fact, greenhouse gases are a good thing to a certain level, because without them, we'd be about 30 degrees Celsius colder. So it'd be about minus 18 degrees centigrade, and life as we know it would not exist. And the Earth has been in this state for geologically temporary periods. And actually all that's got us out of that state is volcanoes. Volcanoes beneath the ice cap melt their way through, and then they spew lots of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and then you get global warming. So global warming per se is not a bad thing. I mean, a certain level of it is important to keep the Earth's climate stable. But what's bad, as I said just now, is the rate of change of greenhouse gases that we're subjecting the Earth to now by burning fossil fuels. And that's something that is taking the Earth out of balance. Now, climate change causes quite a lot of disasters. Generally, it causes more extreme weather events. It's not clear that it causes more storms, but when they happen, they're more serious. And of course, storms lead to floods. Droughts are a real problem. If a drought lasts a year in sub-Saharan Africa, well, you might get through it. If it lasts 2 or 3 years, then you're really severely malnourished. And one of the reasons it's hard to see how many people are dying from the effects of climate change now is that they don't die with a label that says, I died from climate change. Just like people die with COVID, they don't always die exactly from COVID. In the case of droughts, you might have malnutrition, so you're more susceptible to other diseases, so you die from them. But the root cause is the climate change. And that's already estimated, as I said, at several 100,000 people per year. Well, the pandemic has killed nearly 2 million people globally so far, so that probably is worse at the moment. But the pandemic's is just a foretaste of what can happen with climate change unless we take steps to avoid it. You'll all remember Hurricane Katrina about a decade ago, a hurricane that hit the most technologically advanced nation in the world, the richest nation in the world, and yet still killed 1,300 people. They tracked it for a week before it hit land, but it caused flooding, particularly in New Orleans, this Hurricane Katrina. And the people who died, they actually knew it was coming, so they had an evacuation plan, which was to get into your car and drive north to slightly higher ground. You didn't have to get much higher to avoid the flooding. And that was fine if you had a car, if you were rich enough to do that. The poor people, the elderly, the infirm, were mostly the people that lived in the most unpleasant areas, which were below sea level. And they couldn't get away so easily. In fact, there were ranks of school buses parked because in America, as you know, they have yellow school buses to take people to children to school. They were parked up and not used. They could have been used to evacuate people. So the failure was in fairly simple things in that case. But as I say, it's always the poor and the disadvantaged who suffer most. Now, you might not realize this, but the worst killer in the world is not volcanoes, it's not earthquakes, it's not even malnutrition, it's floods, something as mundane as flooding. And even in Britain, floods kill a few people every year, don't they? In the 20th century, floods affected about 100 million per year, and now half the world's population is at risk from storms. And it's partly because we live in cities. More than half the population live in cities instead of rural areas, so they're more vulnerable to disasters. And secondly, people live, cities are built where there's good communication, so they're river valleys or they're by the sea. So amazingly, although we understand disasters more than ever before scientifically, more people die from them than ever have died before. Now, Ban Ki-moon some time ago, a decade ago, said this about climate change. He said it affects us all, unfortunately, not evenly, not equally. Those most likely to suffer first and foremost from the effects of climate change are the poor people. People in sub-Saharan Africa, people in Southeast Asia. Not us, in other words, who actually caused the problem. I'm just going to illustrate that with some maps, which I think are really helpful. This is a map of the world, as you know and love it. It's actually distorted because it's a Mercator projection, but let's go with it because this is what we're used to. I am going to distort the map now by those who are killed by floods. And it's disproportionately Southeast Asia and South America, actually, as well. And these floods are generally predictable. You can see the water coming down the river valleys, but people can't get out of them, can't get out of the way of them. Killed by droughts is predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's happening now as we speak. That continues. And these are entirely avoidable, of course, because there's more than enough food in the world to go around. There's about 800 million people who are clinically overweight, so overweight that they're damaging their health. And there's about 800 million people, the same number, who are malnourished in the world, and many of whom will die from it. So it's not a case of not being enough food, it's that it's not equitably distributed. And that certainly makes it an important ethical and moral issue, particularly for Christians, I think, because many of us have links with these other areas of the world, either through aid work or missionary work. And so we, of all people, should be more aware of it and more conscious of what might be done about it. And of course, it's linked to poverty. This is a map of people living on less than $2 per day, one of the definitions of poverty. The same areas that are suffering from disasters are those poorer areas. I mean, if the sea level rises and you live in Britain, you just raise the Thames barrier a bit higher, which has been done now twice. And we're still at risk. But we can do that. If you live on a delta in Bangladesh, where 30 million people live within 1 meter of sea level, you can't do that. And so they're very vulnerable. And lastly, I want to show where these greenhouse gas carbon production has occurred. Well, of course, it's dominantly in Europe and North America. The exact opposite are those people that are suffering. If I just go back again, they're almost complementary maps. They're opposite maps, if you like. We produce the problem, they're suffering from it. So there's a strong moral reason for us to help mitigate some of those effects. And one of the things I guess I was pleased about until recently was that Britain signed up to give 0.7% of their GDP to aid in overseas countries. Now, it wasn't without strings attached, because often they use British contractors to build the dam or whatever. But at least that was in the right direction. Now, most of the nations of the world signed up to that pledge. Only 7 or 8 have actually fulfilled it over the past 30 or 40 years. And Britain was one of it until very recently, where we've withdrawn from it again. This government has withdrawn us from that pledge of 0.7p in the pound to overseas aid. And I think, again, that's the moral issue that we as Christians ought to be lobbying our MPs about. I mean, there's a practical reason to help overseas people. It gives, they have goodwill towards us. Their talent comes, they're filling our nursing needs and all sorts of other things as well. But it is a basic Christian principle, isn't it, to help others in need. And this is a real problem, I guess, which is that a sixth of the world's population, that's us, produce more than half the carbon emissions. The poorest sixth of the world's population only produce 3% of them, and yet they're the ones that suffer from our actions in the past and present, for that matter. And of course, one of the big issues is the increase of global population. There's 3 times as many people alive today in the world as there were when I was born. I know I've just retired, but I'm not that old. And that is a real issue, because they all should aspire and be eligible for, if you like, as good a standard of living as we have, or at least something approaching it. Well, we could talk a long time about what to do about that, but if we carried on living as we do at the moment, we'd need about 3.5 planet Earths to fulfill our use of natural resources, and that clearly is not sustainable. So that's another issue that many people are conscious of, I guess, but not many of us do much about. I want to show this animation, which is carbon dioxide. It happens to be from 2006, but it would be exactly the same if I had an animation from today. Just everything will be more red, because the redder it is, the more carbon dioxide it is that there is in the atmosphere. And we're stepping through one day at a time, so we're up to about Valentine's Day now, February, in this animation. And what you can see is that, of course, there's more and more carbon dioxide as the year progresses. But the point I want to make, and the point I'm showing it for, is that what we do here affects people right around the globe. I know people often say, well, it's just me. What does it matter if I can't do anything about the global situation? But the point is that every gram of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere is going around the globe. It's affecting everybody else. So we really are our brother's keeper in this sense. And we really do have a responsibility to make amends for some of the damage we're doing elsewhere to other people. Well, I find this quite mesmerizing. I could continue with it. It's carbon monoxide in the southern hemisphere, and if we went through to the equinox, through Midsummer's Day, it swaps around, which you're beginning to see happen now. So it's true of the whole world. But let's move on for now. What causes greenhouse warming, global warming? Well, about 2/3 of it is carbon dioxide. 1/4 of it is methane, even though it's much smaller volume. And then some other things are really powerful. Some of the chlorofluorocarbons are really powerful. But just to put this into context, all the air travel before the lockdown, and it's decreased now, of course, accounted for about 3% of global warming. That's about the same as all the Google searches that you and I are doing. So everything has consequences. So even using our computers now, we're contributing to global warming. That's not to say we shouldn't use them, but we should be conscious of what we're doing and make amends for it. The other thing is that one of the big issues is, as I'm sure you've heard, is eating meat, because every kilogram of meat protein takes 10 kilograms of vegetable protein, and also a lot of water, and people are chopping down forests for it and so on. About 18% of the greenhouse global warming is due to mammals producing methane, actually, from both ends. So actually eating less meat is probably good for you anyway. Eating more vegetarian meat is good for you as well, and makes a very significant difference, actually. That is something everyone can do. And this is sort of a shocking statistic, actually. If you look at the global mass of mammals, 60% of the global mass are livestock, and about 1/3 are humans, and only 4% of the global mass of mammals now are wild mammals. That is what humans have done to this planet. Okay, there's some scientific issues about global climate change. What about some theological issues? Well, here's one. God cares about the world, so we should. I just zoomed in on a discussion you were having. It's pretty obvious he cares for this world, because if you just look at the first chapter of the first book of the Bible in Genesis, every time God created something, he pronounced that it was good, 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 it was good. Whatever else you take from Genesis, you can't miss that message that he created the world he meant it to be, which was fit for his purposes. Saw everything that he made on the 6th day after he'd made humans, said it was very good. So that's the first thing. The second thing about his creation is it's not just made for the sake of humans. He made it because it pleased him to make it the way he did. So you see that from places like, I just pick a couple, Psalm 104, the lions roar for their prey. Who do they seek their food from? They seek it from God. So even predators are part of God's economy in this world. Death is part of life, if you like. Every time we eat something, we kill something. And here's another one from Job. God waters a land where no man lives. It makes a point of saying that. A desert with no one in it, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass. God loves to have fertile surroundings. That's the nature of his character. He's not just doing it for humans. And we sometimes think this world was just made for us, but it's not just made for us, although it is an amazing place for us to live. So there's first point I want to make. And these are all C's, actually, which is a good sermon technique, isn't it? God cares, so we should. God's first commandment to humankind was to care for the world. Actually, a bit stronger than just having sustainable care for it. It's actually having dominion over it. Genesis 1:28, very first command he gave humans: be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. It's a place that needed proper rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And we know how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to do that in the same way as Christ did, as a servant king, as a shepherd king, if you like, a pastor. This is God's command to us, to be looking after the world on his behalf, to having dominion over it in a way that he would, to care for it. So God cares for the world, we should therefore. God commanded us to. And a very obvious thing is that if we want to care for our neighbour, the community aspect, then we should care for the place they live. I've talked about that with respect to climate change. And as Jesus said, from everyone who's been given much, much will be demanded. Well, that is us, friends. That's us. We've been given much, and much will be asked from us. Actually, most secular people would agree with those first three. Well, they might not agree with God's commandment to us, but they'd say, well, yes, we should look after the world, shouldn't we? Should look after each other. This fourth one, the new creation, is obviously one they wouldn't, because it's a specifically Christian hope for the future, that God has said he cares about this world and he's going to renew it in the fullness of time. And the Christian life is an embodied life, and the Christian hope for the future is an embodied hope for the future. This is something, it's not just pie in the sky when we die, floating around on clouds, strumming harps. It is a very down-to-earth, basic thing, which actually, as I like, because I'm a geologist, I have my feet on the ground. I like solid things like that. Luther said this: if I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. He'd grasped hold of this fact that the creation God's created, it has got a future. There will be a new creation. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. Aim at heaven and you get earth thrown in, he said. Aim at earth and you get neither. And I think one thing that's lacking in our present Christian milieu, preaching in our churches and so on, is I hear very little talk about the hope we have for the future, about the new creation. That doesn't seem to come up very often. And yet that is the heart of the gospel, isn't it? The gospel is nothing if it's not got that hope for the future embedded in it. Now, I want to put up Greta Thunberg because before lockdown, she made a big impact going around saying things like, if we were in a war, then we'd do something about climate change. And it struck me actually thinking about this talk that in a pandemic, we are doing things which you would only possibly ever do in a war before now. The mandates, the curtailments on our freedom, the pouring money into specific things, and it's the proper thing to do. Greta said, well, why don't you take climate change seriously and do similar things? And I fear that we're not take it as seriously as we're taking the pandemic, and yet it's going to affect far more people ultimately. It's far more important. And the one difference with climate change is actually, as economists have shown, if you invested 1% of your GDP now in issues affecting climate change, you're likely to reap 2 or 3 times that in the future down the line. It's a good investment to invest in lower cost energy, for example, that doesn't burn fossil fuels. Okay, let's move on to pandemics, which is the thing at the moment that we all know so much about. Just a reminder, really, that viruses are not living organisms in their own right. They can't reproduce. They're just packages of DNA or RNA, and they require the mechanisms of host cells to reproduce. That's what happens when they infect us. They reproduce. Viruses generally don't want to kill you, although a percentage of people are killed by it, because they want to be able to spread and reproduce. The other thing I want to say is that they can be useful. They get a bad press, don't they? But viruses actually can be useful. There are things called bacteriophages. Scientists have been actually using viruses to try and get at some of these superbugs from bacteria, which just can't be got rid of in some hospitals, which are a major problem now. But you can actually use viruses because they're rather good at getting through cell walls. So they can, if you can target them on bacteria, they can be useful for humans. Some mammals use them in symbiotic form. And in fact, even in humans, we do. Some crucial parts of placental development depend on viruses. And about 8% of our human genome is viral inserts. So they can be useful. Where they're not useful is where they get in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is what's happened with the current COVID virus, because it's escaped from an animal host. Now, they're not new viral infections. As you probably all know now, the Spanish flu after the end of the First World War killed between 50 and 100 million people because they really had nothing they could do about it. And more recently, there's been Ebola, AIDS, SARS, MERS, and people have worried about this. And people have known that pandemics are a really high risk for the world. It's just that we haven't done much about preparing for them. And this COVID-19 will not be the last one. There's very likely to be more in the future, but hopefully we will be better prepared in the future. Probably this particular COVID variety came initially from bats because over 96% of the human COVID genome is identical to that found in some bats. Probably it came through a human through an animal vector, maybe pangolins, though we don't know. And maybe it spread through wet meat markets in China. It seems quite likely, where live animals and wet meat, wild meat, are kept in close proximity. But even without that, with the pressure on the environment that we're causing with our human development, we're squeezing wild animals into ever smaller areas, and we're interacting with them more than ever happened before. And so a jump from an animal environment to a human environment is more and more likely anyway. And of course, once it gets into the human environment, if it's spread from humans to humans, it spreads at the speed of a jet airliner, quite literally. And that's what's happened, as we've seen with COVID. Now, I think it's a sign of God's goodness to us that He's made a world that's understandable by science and can be used for the common good. That certainly was the perspective of the founders of the Royal Society. It's written in their charter that of 1662 that they would do their studies of the world for the good, for the glory of God, they said, and for the good of humankind. That's why they did it. They had that in view, and science has done that, hasn't it, with the vaccines that are now being rolled out. Remarkably done it. There's something like 200 vaccines under development already, and there's been great collaboration. So I think that's a sign of God's goodness that we probably will get this particular pandemic under control, because it's made a world we can understand, that's predictable and repeats, and we can address it by science. That it wasn't a given that it should be that way, and I think that's part of His common grace to us. As I said, viruses are not new. Smallpox is a terrible disease, which has been around for millennia. You find it in Egyptian mummies from the 3rd century BC. It was killing 300 million people in the last century alone. It was worse than COVID in the sense that once you got it, you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying. Horrible disease, but it was eradicated globally, officially on May the 8th, 1980, by global vaccination. And that's why vaccinations are such an important tool to control these. So lastly, let me just go through a few Christian responses. No doubt lots of you have been thinking about similar things, but Christian responses to particularly to the COVID pandemic. Well, one thing it has shown up very clearly to the entire world, really, is how it has exposed the inequities and injustices of this world. It's no mistake that it's poorer people living in more deprived social environments that are suffering most. Because if you have a good diet and you're richer, well, you can still die of COVID, as we well know, and we probably all know people that have died of COVID, but disproportionately it's affecting poorer people more. The biblical perspective on disasters is that they happen because we failed to care and live in this world properly, a world which God proclaimed as being very good when he created it. It's as if we've perverted the Lord's Prayer. Instead of saying your will be done, we say my will be done. We've made ourselves into little gods, and we've used the world for our own benefit primarily. And the free will that God gives us means that the Bible often talks about this, that God gives us up to the consequences of our actions. That's part of his respect, if you like, for us as individuals. It doesn't have to be that way, but there are consequences to things we do. And many, almost all disasters can be tracked down to human failings in that way. Now, one of the other things about pandemics is that they give, obviously, this huge opportunity for care for the sick and dying, which has been so much at the forefront of previous plagues and epidemics and pandemics. There was a famous one in the 3rd century Roman Empire, which spread across the empire, which came to be called the Cyprian Plague, because Bishop Cyprian played a prominent part in urging Christians to stay, in his case, in Carthage to help the dying. Now, there had been persecution of Christians there, and so this was completely countercultural, if you like. The regular response of people in Carthage was, first of all, to flee the city, and then if somebody in the family got ill, they put them out in the street because they didn't want to get it too. Christians did exactly the opposite. They stayed there in Carthage to help the dying, even though, as I say, they had actually not many years before been persecuted as Christians. Luther made a similar point, remaining in Wittenberg in the 16th century rather than fleeing. And it is a fact that revivals of Christianity have often followed plagues. And that was the case in the Cyprian plague, for example, because people saw how Christians reacted. I mean, just actions speak louder than words, as I said here, that people saw what Christians did. Another thing this pandemic has done, it's really shown up again the value of community relationships. Now, we live in a very individualistic culture, don't we? Where it's what matters to me that I do. And the isolation has made us realize the value of community relationships in a very forceful way. Of course, this is a Christian perspective, as the Apostle Paul said in Philippians, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interests of the others. And Christianity is a relational religion, primarily relation with God, and secondly, relation with our brothers and sisters and others around us. And certainly the pandemic has thrown up the importance of this. I don't know about you, but down my street, there's a WhatsApp group. And, you know, if somebody's going shopping, they'll say, look, I'm going to the shop today, so you don't have to let me know what you want, and I'll pick it up, and I'll pick up your medicines and all kinds of things like that, just in a very practical way. And I think the Christian church obviously is doing huge amounts of this sort of thing, but it is actually a really important point that we can make use of it, if you like. This is a springboard actually for showing people what Christianity is all about. It's made many of us reevaluate our purposes and our values as we've been stopped from doing things that we'd planned to do. And as C.S. Lewis said, even in our suffering, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And again, here's a real opportunity to speak into this situation with a Christian perspective. it enables us in a very practical way to have conversations about death, because people around us, people we know, are dying all the time. And again, something Bishop Cyprian said to his followers in a famous sermon, which you can get off the web actually. If you truly believe in God, he said, why do you who are destined to be with God and secure in the promise of the Lord not rejoice that you're called to Christ and be glad that you're free from the devil? Not language we use today, but this motivated much of the Christian work with sick and dying. And I'm sure we're seeing that in our hospitals today as well. A perspective we don't often talk about, I think, in our current Christian church is the role of grief and lament. And actually, this should make us lament. The world is not how God meant it to be, and it's because of human sinfulness, as Ruth, I think, said not many minutes ago. That the world is groaning. It's not the way it's meant to be. And we should lament that. And this should draw us back to God and should draw others back to God as well. And it's a proper response. And then, as I said earlier, Christians of all people have hope for the future. And as Paul said, who suffered all kinds of suffering from being beaten up, through being shipwrecked, to being suffering from drought, suffering from starvation and famine, all kinds of things. But he said, so he knew what suffering was, imprisonment as well. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. Of course, the creation is waiting for it to be restored to how God meant it to be, so it can give glory to God in the way he meant it to. The whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And one thing we know about childbirth, just from observation, because of course I haven't been through it, it's an extremely painful thing. But I also, just from straight observation, is that as soon as that child is born, there is a completely different perspective on it by the mother. The joy of that new birth is amazing. So that's the picture that Paul is giving of our present situation. And of course, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. And the Bible talks about not making all new things, but renewing things, making the world the way it's meant to be in the fullness of its time, and of God himself coming down to dwell with us on earth. So here's a real reason to be committed to this material world. I often say that Christianity is a very materialistic religion in that sense, that we are people, body and soul together. It's embedded in the material world. And that hope is really important, as Karl Barth said. Without hope, there's no freedom, but only imprisonment, no grace, but only condemnation and corruption, no divine guidance, but only fate, no God, but only a mirror of unredeemed humanity. And if nothing else, we should be holding up that hope for the future as Christians in this situation at the moment. And as Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institute of Health in the USA, the biggest scientific organization in the world, and is a lovely Christian man, the only thing that spreads faster than a virus is hope, he said. And of course, we are repositories of that hope. That is what motivates us in the gospel. So that's what I'd leave you with, brothers and sisters. Here's a real opportunity within this pandemic to be spreading that hope for the future. So there's a summary. God cares, so we should. God commanded us to care about the world. We're commanded to care for our neighbor, and there is a new creation which gives Christian hope for the future. And actually, Keith mentioned some books at the beginning, so I will put them up, that actually, this is why I wrote with Jonathan Moo, the book on the right-hand side, Hope in an Age of Despair, which links the theology and the science of the situation with climate change, those top ones. And I just wanted to draw attention to a book we've just published just last 6 weeks ago or so, What Good is God, which is a series of chapters by different people who have experienced disasters, and have from a doctor who's worked with Ebola in Africa, through a survivor in Haiti, a pastor in Haiti, a pastor who lost their daughter in the Lockerbie bombing, a mother and daughter who lost everything in Haiti and lived in tents and refugee camps. And what comes through with all these people, with having undergone terrible, terrible experiences, you'd think this might destroy their trust in God. But actually it's the opposite. And what we found with my colleague Roger Abbott researching these disasters is that actually trusting God gives you a framework. If you had a trust in God before the disaster, it was strengthened by the disaster because you had a framework in which to place it, and because you believed in a sovereign God. And the people who fell apart, who weren't resilient, actually, were those who had no faith before. So contrary to what you might think, where you might say, well, how can you believe in a good God after this disaster? It's actually the opposite way around. Anyway, I've talked enough. What I'd like to do is throw it open to questions now. I'll stop sharing the screen and hopefully hand over to you.